previous video of mine, I talked about the cEDH metagame of 2023, and in this follow-up video we're gonna look at the best stax cards versus that, dividing them into 3 categories. The absolutely recommended ones, cards that are good but they come with problems, and finally, not recommended. Let's start with that one, not so recommended ones. First one up might be a surprise to a lot of you, Blood Moon. Used to be a really good one previously, but today there's just a lot of ways to get past Blood Moon effect. A lot of your opponents are usually on the colored entity red that is able to generate treasures in various tricks to solve the Blood Moon problem. But another big card that is like in everyone's deck is Arcane Signet, that solves the problem too. And if someone just gets a Bird of Paradise into play before the Blood Moon, which usually happens, then they are fine too. Next one, Contamination. I think a lot of people are gonna disagree with me, but I've rarely seen this in action. Usually when you play stacks, you wanna keep creatures in action. So you need to have a deck that is actually able to play this to begin with. But for the same reasons as players are able to get past Blood Moon, they are usually able to get past Contamination as well. Don't really recommend this. Winter Orb. This one isn't that strong either actually. It does have an effect, and it can certainly affect some players here and there. But as the speed of this format is so fast, this doesn't really have an effect on the things we wanna attack. This is a card that is really good in longer games, but the cEDH format is threatening really fast currently. And people are usually sitting on a really low amount of lands, so they aren't really affected by this thing to begin with either. Following up with Archon of Valor's Reach. I actually like this thing and I think it's quite cool, and I have seen it in action in some games here and there. Strangely though, it actually makes you go down a trap in my opinion. I want to emphasize that it's a trap. You see, when you're actually including this card inside your deck, you're going for something of a win-con-less strategy, usually because of that really expensive cost of 6 mana totally. I want to compare it with Sanctum Prelate, a much cheaper version. We're going to talk about Sanctum Prelate later. Spoilers, it's quite decent. But Archon is only shutting down one specific thing, so you need to be very skilled in using it, and you might miss, and you might be allowing people to play what they want to play. For example, you want to say instant, but it should have said sorcery instead. But the expensive cost of Archon's Valor's Reach just makes it very tricky to add inside the 99 in my opinion. Compared to Sanctum Prelate, that does the job a lot better. Then we have Gadok Teeg. I actually really like Gadok Teeg. Now he is actually affecting Ad Nauseam, and that's a very popular card that we need to attack. But in general, that's like it. That's the only thing he usually affects. Now sure, he does affect your opponent's Court of Calling, but he also affects your Court of Calling. And when you're adding Gadok Teeg to your deck, that's usually a card you want to have inside your deck too. I have actually played Gadok Teeg a bunch, and yes, he does affect Ad Nauseam, but in my opinion, that's not enough. There are better cards than this. Next up is Counterbalance, and I know a lot of people are gonna disagree with Counterbalance, but I've honestly never been a fan of it. The only effect I've actually seen this thing do is a psychological effect. People might be hesitant in doing their actions just because that big maybe. And sometimes it does hit something, but I've seen so many games where it never did anything. I think there are much better cards than this card to add to your 99 stax deck. Next one I want to talk about and not recommend is Harsh Mentor. I really like this card. I have it in a bunch of decks. It used to be quite good when people were on this strategy, Dramatic Reversal Isochron Scepter, because yeah, you can gain infinite mana, but you will die to infinite damage before you do that. But the simple truth is that this combo has fallen off, and therefore Harsh Mentor isn't that awesome anymore. It is quite cool when you put a Curiosity on it though. But don't play this. I played it so much that I can tell you that you shouldn't add it to your 99. But let's proceed and look at cards that are good, but they come with problems, like things you can't auto-include, but they are quite good. The first one I want to talk about is Humility. This is amazing. It's affecting close to every single cEDH deck out there, because even in those decks that don't really contain many creatures at all, Thassa's Oracle still doesn't do anything. So yeah, this has an effect against every cEDH deck out there, more or less. Even those that aren't on Thassa's Oracle, that are on creatures, will be devastated by this thing. The big problem is that there are so few decks that can actually play this. It is a really cool card inside Tevesh and Ishai, and also Aminato. Those commander pairs can actually function through this thing, because Tevesh can still generate card draw. And by the way, those thralls will actually be upgraded from 0/1s to 1/1s. So if you have a deck that can actually include this, then you're on a good path. This trick is actually just to have that deck that can include this. Next card on my list is the Tabernacle. I really like this card. Big favorite. But it's not that amazing. Okay, it's actually kind of good, but it's like a little bit strange and tricky. It does affect you as well, so you need to have a deck that is actually capable of including this, similar to Humility. Like, you don't want to have that many creatures to begin with, but you do want to have a lot of mana producing capabilities. It has never really taken over the game, but it has affected opponents in a good way, so to say. Decks that contain a lot of creatures are really slowed down by this thing. So it is a card that I would like to recommend if your deck is able to play with it. And yeah, if you have the money to begin with as well, unless you're proxying. Blind Obedience is the next one. This is actually an easy include in most decks, so to say. You only need white and then you have a cool enchantment that will affect people's here and there. But it is a little bit narrow, and there are better cards out there to do this kind of job, and it doesn't really affect that much. So in this card specific case, I think there are better cards, but it's absolutely a card you could include, nothing wrong with it. But if you really, I think the only reason you're actually including this is just if you're looking for more variance, more stacks card to increase the density inside your deck. There are just other cards you should select before this to begin with. Back to Basic is awesome in my opinion. Non-basic lands don't untap during their controller's untap step. That has an effect. Not like, yeah, it's like making your opponents slow down, and if you can nail this in a perfect timing, you can kill people with it. It has that same problem as Winter Orb though. There are decks that don't really care that much about it, but usually you will make people suffer with this. The problem is once again that it's something you can't really auto-include in every single deck. It's very narrow that you can include this. It's usually only played inside mono blue and that's it, but that's where it really belongs. I have actually built decks on 5 colors, only containing basic land, and make this thing work. So it works outside of that mono blue, but you really need to tweak your deck to make this work. But it's still quite decent inside the metagame. We talked about Winter Orb before and how that wasn't that great. Static Orb on the other hand is a little bit more better, because this is affecting everything that is tapping for mana, artifacts and creatures as well, so it has a bigger reach. But I still don't think this is like the super recommended thing you can include, because it's still a bit narrow. Or how should I put it? It's not really great versus the current metagame style your opponents are doing. Like, it's doing a good job versus decks that wanna play a mid-range, long, grindy game, but versus Turbo Adnas and Turbo Breach, Turbo Fasces, it doesn't do that much. Games are just over before this has an effect. Cindervines. This one is actually affecting a lot of these storm decks, like someone cast Adnos and then they're gonna sit there and storm. They're gonna die to Cindervines before they get to do their thing. But in practice, like, I playtested this, seen how it works, it doesn't really affect your opponents enough, because a simple reason. Opponents can storm with Adnos a tiny bit, cast a few spells and then destroy it before they die to it. Like, if someone draws their entire deck, they're gonna be able to solve this Cindervines problem. So I've never really seen it securely make my game safe as I pass turn cycle with this in play. But it is still like doing a small job. It's hitting the correct thing it needs to hit. And if you have other things to back this up, it's gonna solve the problem. It's gonna be a good way to make sure you're getting to that staxy long grindy game you wanna have with this card in play. And the ability to sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment, great. It's never really a dead card, it's just that it's hard to absolutely recommend it. Even Mind Sensor used to be the best anti-search card in the game. Spoilers alert, I think you can guess which one is gonna replace it. We have Power Creeped, a better card than this, so it's still good, it's something you can include, but there are cards that does the same thing, but better, that we're gonna include before this. Let's also just throw these two cards together in here to make the video faster. Hushbringer and Hushwing, they are quite good, but they're shutting you down as well. This is a similar problem to Humility. They come into play quite early in the game, but you have to have a deck that is able to play through this yourself, so to say. And most decks in this game wanna win with ETB in some form of way, usually. That is where we have this thing, Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, that is absolutely amazing. I have it in a bunch of my decks and I really like it. Because you don't need to break parity against it. It only affects your opponent's ETB effect while doubling yours. That is amazing. It's hitting the metagame in a really good way. There's one problem, and the big reason why I'm not recommending it, it's a very expensive card. 5 mana is quite a lot. So you really need to think about before you include this one inside your 99. I recommend it, but it's not something for every deck. Rule of Law is absolutely amazing and absolutely recommended. However, this is not that awesome. There are better versions than this. Even though this is like the original, actually that is not true. Arcane Laboratory is the absolute original, the first one we saw in the game. But these two cards are actually a bit too slow. That's strange to say, but they are too slow and too weak. Their mana cost should be lower. I think these are cards you could include if you're just looking for more variants of the same, because in the recommended slot we're gonna look at soon, we have better cards, better versions than this. I don't think I've had any one of these cards in any of my decks for a long while right now. Normally Ashok should come a little bit higher inside this list, but this is a planeswalker, and because of that, it is something that can be removed with creatures. If someone has a really big attacker, they can say, "Be gone, Ashok." There are so many games where I wanna cast Ashok, but it's never gonna survive the turn cycle, so that's just throwing a card away. Well, on the other hand, you're ripping someone's or everyone's graveyard, so you could cast it, remove all graveyards, and then it dies. And that is something, but you basically mostly play it for the ability to make sure your opponents can't search. But the fact that it is a planeswalker means that you have to have a deck that is able to defend it. So it's not like something you can auto-include without thinking about it. It's something you have to have a deck that is able to have it to begin with. Same thing can be said about Narset Parter of Veils. Really good, but it's a planeswalker, so you have to have a deck that can defend it. Another stax interesting planeswalker is the Fairy Time Reveler. This one you don't need to defend, you need to kill. If you put this into play and you pass turn, there is a chance you're gonna lose the game because you're giving opponents Grand Abolishers. You really have to have a deck that is able to play this in a cool way. Now there are combos with this, it's a stax piece in form of protecting yourself during your turn like a Grand Abolisher, but be careful on how you use this. Next card I want to showcase is Yasharn Implacable Earth. I have played this a lot and I really like it inside the 99. I don't like it as a commander, stop playing this as a commander, it's bad as a commander, but it's awesome inside the 99. It is currently affecting so many different things in this game. Like the ability isn't really doing that much, but when you look at how many cards it's actually affecting, it's a lot of them. In some form of shape or form it will attack almost every combo in the game, or well, the big ones. But it will also affect so many cards during the game, like Fetch Lands doesn't work, Necropotence doesn't work, you can't sacrifice, etc, etc. Treasures doesn't work, Lionside Diamond doesn't work. People just struggle when this thing is in play. But the big reason why it's not up there in the absolute recommended spot is simply because it's also affecting you, so you have to have a deck that is able to play through this on your board state as well. Those decks exist, and therefore this is seeing some play here and there, but you need to think about how you're including this and how you're tweaking your deck and what form of win cons you're gonna have that can win even though you have the big vegan bacon in play. I would also like to mention that this is actually a really big creature, 4/4 for 4 mana. Yeah, it can actually smash face, pretty good. Next we have Containment Priest. If a non-token creature would enter the battlefield and it wasn't cast, exile it instead. This is great. Flash, 2 mana, really easy to get into play, but the ability is really narrow. It does have a huge effect versus some decks here and there, but there are just so many decks that doesn't care about this. Like the big decks we wanna stax out don't care one bit versus this. So there's just a chance that this is gonna sit there and do nothing. And in my opinion, it's not really affecting the big decks we wanna attack, but it's affecting some decks here and there that is a little bit outside of the typical Oddnos grix's stuff. Definitely a card to consider if your deck could include it and you're not really tricking creatures into play, you're casting them. Then this is a card you could have, because this is actually affecting you as well. Next one is Rurik Tar. Now this is a really cool card. So it absolutely affects like the Spellslinger decks, that's great. And it is a big creature, so if you're going up against like creature-oriented stax decks, you can attack those and kill them eventually. Like this is powerhouse, absolutely great. Big problem though, it's really expensive. It is not something you can auto-include into any form of deck, shape or form, but it is really good. Like if you can get this into play, the best way in my opinion is to trick it into play. I've gotten a token into play with Arcane Artisan for only 3 mana instead of 6. I kinda think that's quite awesome, but you need to have a deck that is able to enjoy Arcane Artisan to begin with to utilize that kind of synergy, so I don't think Ruriktar is an auto-include for most decks. It's something you can have if you're having that form of cool synergy trick, in my opinion, and also if you don't have that many spells, non-creature spells yourself, so Ruriktar could literally kill you. You need to build a deck that is heavy on creature and heavy on getting expensive creatures into play to have it inside the 99, in my opinion. Same thing should be said about Elish Norn as well, by the way. Really expensive. If you get this into play, you have a chance of winning the game in beatdown as well as staxing your opponents. Creatures will literally die here and there if you have this in play for your opponents, but that really expensive 7 mana is tricky. Toxrill the Corrosive should also be mentioned here as well. Really good. I enjoy it inside those decks that can utilize and get really expensive creatures into play, but that 7 mana is just so expensive. It's gonna come into play in a mid-late game stage, so to say. Same thing with Sire of Insanity. Really awesome. Now you have to have a deck that don't really care about having a hand when you're having this inside your deck, by the way. A deck that is good at emptying its hand, throwing all creatures into play, then Sire of Insanity might be good for you. But also that really expensive mana cost means that you have to have tricks to get it into play. Now Arcane Artisan is just an example. There are other awesome tricks as well. Void Winnower is awesome in my opinion. It affects so many different cards out there in the format that you want to attack. Great stacks card, but that 9 mana is making it close to impossible to add to your deck. You have to have a deck that is literally on Gaia's Cradle or able to trick creatures like we showcased and talked about before into play. If you can add this, try to add it to your deck. You're not gonna be disappointed. I did have a deck once with Esika, God of the Tree, but we used the enchantment version to put polymorph, or well, literally flip big expensive creatures directly into play instead of casting them, and Void Winnower was inside that deck, and that felt correct and great. Like, that is a deck that can go to beatdown with enormous Eldrazi Titans to smash face and stacks out the game, but it can only be included in that form of kind of deck that is able to trick those creatures into play. But now let's look at the all-stars, the things I absolutely recommend, things you should have inside your stacks decks on almost an auto-include if you're looking for stacks cards, so to say, or well, the best among the best stacks cards, you could say. So first one up, we have Oppo Agent. You might have guessed this already. This is the best anti-search card you could get your hands on. It has flash, 3 mana, that is fine, and you get a value once you cast it if you're able to steal something from an opponent. I really like this card. I think it's awesome. Dowdy Voidwalker is currently the best anti-graveyard card in my opinion, because you're gaining value from it. Like, even if you're going up against opponents that aren't on a graveyard strategy, then they're still gonna cast things and put them into the Dowdy Voidwalker exile zone. So you can cantrip with this. You're gonna get value even though it doesn't actually attack and interact your opponents at all. I decided to have the Black Lotus background for this one because that's how strong I think Draenei Magistrate actually is. It's attacking commander-centric orientated decks. You can get this into play like turn 1 or turn 2 quite efficiently, and then you can shut a deck from being able to play completely. If you're going up against like Venota or any form of creature orientated deck with their commander focused, then that's just shut down completely. Also, this is attacking a lot of breach strategies as well. This is a must-have, auto-include if you're on white and you're including stacks cards. Best, almost the best stacks card in the format. Let's actually keep the Black Lotus background for this one too. Archon of Emeria is amazing. If you're a starting player and you can get this into play turn 1, pass turn with a mana crypto, then that's a good game. You basically time warp because your opponents are usually gonna put a fetch land into play tapped or a land into play tapped and pass turn. So this is just taking over the game so fast in terms of speed, just because your opponent's non-basic lands come into play tapped, but also they can only cast 1 spell per turn, and that's the big reason you play this thing. It just has so much value for 3 mana. Being a creature, this is something you can tutor for easier compared to the Rule of Law. This is the much better card compared to Rule of Law. Deafening Silence is very similar, but it's just 1 white mana. That is so good. You can get this into play. Now, it's not affecting creatures, but that's fine. Just 1 white mana is amazing, and it's affecting so many decks out there currently. Ediswan Canonist is 2 mana, still pretty good. Like, this is affecting everything that isn't artifact. So there's a few decks that can actually play around this quite easily. I have actually seen this in some storm decks that are storming with artifacts just because they're able to interact versus everyone else and breaking parity against it. But it's actually pretty good. A few spellslinger decks can actually play through this, but in general it's having a really good effect in general, and you can get it quite fast into play. Big problem is that it's an artifact, so it's something your opponents could destroy. So let's look at all these cards as a collective. They're all making things more expensive, and I think they are all awesome. The current metagame more or less could be described as making it hard or impossible for your opponents to cast spells, because if they can't cast spells, then they can't really do much. And this is absolutely making it hard for your opponents to cast spells. Now it could actually make it hard for you to cast your spells, but if you're that mid-range stax deck that is trying to go for the longer game, then you're usually not going to be trying to cast many spells. You're going to cast the big spells, and then that's fine. Also, if you're casting a lot of creatures, you don't really care about these things. And there are so many great variations to these cards, by the way. If you want to go more focused on artifacts, and here are some other examples for you. They usually have a really big impact in every single game they go into in the current metagame, in my experience at the very least. Then we have the Nullrod package with Collector Roof and Stony Silence following right after. Nullrod was the first one to come, then we had Stony Silence, and then last, the newest card is Collector Roof, and that's the big dominator of the three, because that is something you can actually tutor for with various green creature tutors. And when you're usually building stax decks these days, you rather stay on creatures in general because it's easier to synergize with creatures in a creature stacks oriented deck. So Collector Roof is the one you usually play, but Nullrod and Stony Silence are perfectly fine depending on what form of strange variants. Like you could be on a very artifact enchantment oriented stacks deck, and those are usually the cards you want to have instead in that case. But Collector Roof is the better version because it will synergize better with most other cards you could think of. But these cards are currently awesome. They are having a huge effect in most games they go into these days. Laviniasaurus Renegade is a card that I've started to like more and more, and I've never really felt off adding it to my deck or putting it into play. It usually always does something. Because something I said early in this video was that the game is really fast and people don't have that many lands in play usually. And therefore this creature is able to interact with just so many things early in the game just because people don't actually have lands enough to cast their things. Well, they have other things like artifacts, rituals and creatures to get their big expensive spells into play, but they don't have the land count. I've noticed that the longer the game goes, she doesn't have that much effect anymore because eventually when people have enough mana, then she kind of falls off. But she is so awesome in the early stage of the game before people actually have the enough land count to pay for their things. So I really recommend her. You should absolutely try to playtest with her a bunch, if you have the colored identity for it. Mayhem Devil is also a card that has proven to be quite awesome in general. You're getting sack triggers a little bit here and there all the time, and also you can actually teamwork with opponents here and there. Like, okay, we need to kill that creature over there, could you sacrifice your fetch land? Yeah, sure. And you're getting some triggers from an opponent to deal with another one of your opponent. You usually play it because of the combo reasons. Like, if you are able to generate infinite treasures, this is an outlet to win from those infinite treasures. But the sheer fact that you're able to interact a little bit here and there with your opponents means that this is actually quite an awesome card. And believe it or not, it does more than you think. Notion Thief is the best anti-card draw we currently have inside the format. There are a lot of other variants. Well, Hullbreacher used to be the best one, but that got banned. It is a little bit expensive, but in general you might draw a few cards when you cast this. So it has this like cantrip value, you get some value from it when you use it, and then from the rest of the game your opponents can't utilize it. Also there's a combo with this, basically with Wheel of Fortune. Your opponents will go to Hellbent mode and you're gonna draw 27 cards. And from 27 cards you should probably be able to win the game. Card draw is quite key inside the format. Usually people wanna burst card draw in the game, and a lot of opponents are actually playing wheels these days. And this is like the best anti-card if your opponents are heavily on wheels. Like if all of your free opponents are on wheels, having Notion Thief inside your deck is just absolutely amazing because you can win the game from their wheel. It is a bit expensive, but I've never really felt wrong having it inside my stacks oriented creature decks. I am a little bit surprised this doesn't see more play than it does, This is amazing. Hour of Silence is awesome. Artifact enchanted spells target opponent cost 2 more to play. This is increasing the casting cost of basically almost everything for most spellslinger decks in the game, and you can sacrifice it to destroy the Underworld Breach. So I absolutely recommend this. If you can add this to your deck, then try to do so. Now it is free mana, so it's a little bit expensive. Double white is also quite annoying, but even if someone destroys it, you can still sacrifice to destroy an arcane signet across the table. Like eventually your opponents are gonna try to destroy this, and then it just basically becomes a spot removal for itself. Like the value from this card is so good. Like they will use a spot removal, you will destroy an arcane signet, so you're already trading really well right there, but also increasing the casting cost for as long as it stays around is quite good too. Kataki in my opinion is awesome in the current format. Something I said earlier in the video is that it's a very fast, turbo-orientated format. People wanna win fast, and Kataki can slow down the game. A lot of these turbo, odd-nos strategies are on heavily artifact counts and are getting these ritual artifacts early into play and then pass turn. If you can follow up with a Kataki, their next turn is just gonna be so much slowed down. It's never really having a huge impact, like it's never really taking over the game, but for 2 mana it is doing quite a lot. Root Maze is another worthy example of a card that is slowing down the game so much. For only, I wanna repeat, only 1 green mana, you can get this thing into play that is making your opponents suffer. Or well, you're also suffering, but if you're playing a deck that you wanna get to a longer stage game, then this is gonna help you out. Turbo decks are just gonna be slowed down so much. I have seen so many games where Root Maze comes into play and just dictates and orientates the game around it. I think a lot of more people should be playing Dampening Sphere. It's only 2 colorless mana, so a lot of decks could actually include this thing. Now it's making your opponent's Gaia's Cradle and yours too tap for colorless mana. But also each spell a player casts costs 1 more to cast for each other spell that player has cast this turn. It's like a colorless Rule of Law version. It's currently affecting the format in a great way, and I absolutely want to recommend this thing. Now I did mention Sanctum Prelate before in a spoiler, and I think it's awesome. Now I was thinking of actually putting it in the not always recommended, the middle version number 2, but it's actually really good. The reason I was thinking about having it a little bit lower on the list is simply because that you need to have some skill utilizing this thing. You need to know what number you're gonna say. But on the other hand, if we're just adding the category that we're all really good players and we know what our opponents are gonna try to do, which is a big criteria to play stax decks to begin with, by the way. You only play stax decks when you really know about the format in general, when you understand your opponents and what your opponents wanna do. So therefore, we can easily conclude that you're always gonna say value number 2 on this thing, because 2 is usually what interrupts you. Cyclonic Rift, various other board wipes, most spot removals, and Underworld Breach, etc. There are some arguments for 1 as well, but I find 2 to be a little bit more useful. But the value you're setting on this could vary from game to game, by the way, as well. But I think this is great. It's usually having a great effect when you're putting it into play. Now it is possible to get rid of it, but it's actually having a lot of effect, usually. Like it demands that your opponents are actually able to remove it. The last card I want to talk about inside this video, and let's bring back that Black Lotus wallpaper again, because this is a great card you should absolutely always have if you're on white, Grand Abolisher. Now this is actually not a card that is affecting your opponents during their turn, it is a selfish card that's helping you win during your turn. So it's not really a stax card. But the big reason I want to emphasize and put this up here on the picture is simply because I really want to emphasize that you should be having a way to win the game yourself. And you could argue that it's making it impossible for your opponents to use their Force of Wills during your turn, so it's kind of preventing your opponents from actually playing their cards, so to say. Because now you can establish your board state without caring about what your opponents could potentially do, like they can't Force of Will you anymore. And that means that you can eventually put your win con into play, your combo with your stacks oriented deck into play and win the game through opponents' counterspells. And try to avoid win conless stax decks that are just trying to overrun your opponents with creatures. That will usually never really work. It takes too much time to do that. So me showcasing Grand Abolisher, you just want to emphasize the importance of having a combo inside your stax deck as well. Now a lot of cards was left out, but I hope this gives you an idea of what to look for. There are many other versions of cards we already looked at, but what I showcase is what I want to emphasize. Especially the bad ones too, like cards I don't recommend. It should give you an idea of cards to kind of stay away from, in my personal opinion, and other versions of those cards that I showcased in the beginning. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something cool and new. Take care guys, I'll see you in the next video.